as possible, if only anyone had been willing to look seriously. The communities that have lived within the Congo Basin for generations were never in any doubt about what the forest contained. The oral traditions of indigenous groups throughout the region describe serpents of enormous size, not in the vague generalities of myth, but in the specific, practical language of people who share territory with a real and potentially dangerous animal. Hunters speak of avoiding particular river systems where giant snakes are known to ambush prey, of encountering tracks in riverside mud with dimensions that exceed anything attributable to the known python species of the region, of witnessing the aftermath of predation events involving prey animals of the size that no documented snake could have taken. These accounts were treated for generations by Western scientific visitors with a condescension that the subsequent evidence has thoroughly discredited. The people who lived closest to this creature knew it existed. The infrastructure of their relationship with it, the avoidance zones, the spiritual significance attached to the animal, the specific behavioral knowledge embedded in their hunting traditions, all of it reflected an accumulated understanding built from real encounters across real generations. Science's failure to take this knowledge seriously was not a neutral oversight. It was a choice to privilege one epistemological framework over another, and it delayed the formal documentation of a species by decades. The modern chain of evidence that eventually forced the scientific community to confront what local knowledge had always indicated began with camera trap footage collected by a team of conservation biologists who entered a remote section of the Congo Basin in 2019 for a biodiversity survey not specifically focused on large reptiles. The cameras they placed along game trails and near water sources captured footage that the researchers chose not to immediately share with the broader scientific community, because they understood what kind of response unverified footage of this nature would generate. What the footage showed was unmistakable in terms of scale, even when individual details were obscured by vegetation and low light. Serpent bodies of diameter and apparent length that exceeded every reference point available from the known fauna of the region moved through the frame with the slow, heavy deliberateness of animals that have no predators to avoid. When researchers used known tree species and fallen logs as scale references and applied standard photogrammetric techniques to estimate dimensions, the numbers they arrived at were deeply uncomfortable for anyone committed to the existing scientific consensus. Lengths in excess of 40 feet and body diameters approaching 2 feet placed these animals in a category the scientific record simply did not contain. The response within the research team was not one of triumphant announcement. It was one of careful, almost anxious deliberation about how to proceed in a way that would not invite wholesale dismissal. The footage was real and the analysis was rigorous. But the researchers understood that the scientific establishment would require more, a dedicated expedition with the explicit objective of documenting these animals directly, with equipment capable of capturing measurements and samples that would withstand the scrutiny of formal peer review. The expedition that departed in late 2023 was not organized by enthusiasts or cryptozoologists. It was a serious scientific enterprise backed by universities and conservation organizations, and its participants included researchers who arrived with the explicit expectation of demonstrating that the camera trap footage had overstated what the animals actually were. Dr. Sarah Kendrick, one of the world's foremost authorities on giant constricting snakes, joined the expedition in a spirit of rigorous skepticism. With 20 years of fieldwork studying the largest known species, anacondas in the Amazon, reticulated pythons in Southeast Asia, she has spent her career developing an intimate empirical understanding of what the largest known snakes looked like in the field. Nothing in that experience prepared her for what the expedition encountered. The moment of direct observation came at dawn, when a massive python emerged from the water at a riverbank that local guides had identified as a site of regular activity. The animal moved with the unhurried, heavy grace of a creature whose size placed it entirely outside the range of anything that needed to be cautious about the world around it. Kendrick later described her reaction as a complete suspension of the professional frameworks she had built over 2 decades, a moment where the gap between what she was seeing and what she had believed was possible became so obvious that the only response was to accept the evidence in front of her. The laser rangefinders and telephoto equipment the team had brought produced measurements validated from multiple positions and camera angles. The animal they were observing was between 48 and 52 feet in length, with a body diameter of approximately 26 inches and an estimated weight between 800 and 1,000 pounds. Over the following weeks, 3 additional individuals of comparable dimensions were documented, establishing that what they were looking at was not a single anomalous individual, but a species. Genetic analysis of shed skin samples collected during the expedition, sent to 3 independent laboratories, added a scientific dimension to the discovery that went beyond the dramatic fact of the animal's size. The DNA was unambiguously python in its overall structure, confirming that these animals are members of the family that includes Africa's known large constrictors. But the specific genetic distance between these samples and their closest known relative, the Central African rock python, was substantial enough to establish that the populations have been evolving separately for somewhere between 8 and 12 million years. This was not a variant of a known species. It was a distinct lineage that had diverged in the isolation of the Congo Basin stable swamp forest over geological time, developing a suite of genetic adaptations related to growth hormone regulation and metabolic efficiency that appear to underlie the exceptional sizes these animals are capable of reaching. The morphological characteristics that distinguish them from known African pythons reinforce the genetic picture, a proportionally larger and more robust H. There's a place on this planet where the trees grow so densely and the waterways twist so completely through the landscape that vast territories have never been meaningfully surveyed by scientists, where the canopy closes overhead like a ceiling and the ground below becomes a world of permanent shadow and ceaseless, undocumented movement. The Congo Basin in Central Africa is not simply a large forest. It is a system of such staggering complexity and scale that it functions almost as a separate planet within our own, operating according to ecological rules that have remained stable for millions of years while the rest of the world changed around it. And within this system, in the darkest and most inaccessible corridors of wetlands and swamp forest, something has been living that the scientific community spent decades insisting could not exist. The stories were too old, too consistent, and too specific to be entirely invented, but they were also too extreme to be accepted by a scientific establishment that had drawn firm boundaries around what biology permitted. Those boundaries have now been broken. The giant Congo snake is not a legend. It is not an exaggeration of a known species. It is real. It has been formally documented, and it is considerably larger than anything the scientific record previously contained. The foundational account that serious researchers have returned to when tracing the documented history of reports about this creature comes from 1959, when a military pilot with an established reputation for precision observation made a claim that the scientific establishment spent the following 6 decades doing everything it could to explain away. Colonel Remy van Leerd was a decorated Belgian Air Force veteran, not the kind of person whose professional background inclined him toward dramatic fabrication or wishful interpretation of ambiguous phenomena. While flying over a remote region of what was then the Belgian Congo, he observed from the air a serpent of dimensions he described with the specific confidence of a man who had spent his career making accurate visual assessments under pressure. He estimated the creature at approximately 50 feet in length, with a head the size of a horse and a body diameter consistent with a mature tree trunk. When his helicopter approached and descended, the animal reared its head in a defensive response, giving him a view of its scale that he found profoundly disturbing. He took photographs from the air. Those photographs were subjected to extensive analysis over the years, but the combination of image quality, viewing angle, and the absence of any documented species that could account for what was captured meant that they could be neither confirmed nor definitively refuted. Van Leerd maintained the accuracy of his account until he died. The scientific community maintained its skepticism for the same duration. That skepticism was not unreasonable on its own terms. The largest snakes confirmed by science at that time, and for decades afterward, were reticulated pythons from Southeast Asia and green anacondas from South America, both of which occasionally reached lengths in the region of 25 to 30 feet, representing the outer boundary of what vertebrate biology was understood to support in the snake body plan. A snake twice that length was not merely an incremental extension of the known range. It was a categorically different animal, one whose existence would require a fundamentally different understanding of the metabolic, structural, and ecological conditions that snake physiology could accommodate. Without physical evidence, without a specimen or reliably measurable encounter, the scientific preference for a simpler explanation, that Van Leerd had seen a large but known species and had overestimated its dimensions in the excitement of the moment, was defensible. It was also as subsequent events made clear, wrong. Understanding why this discovery is biologically plausible rather than merely dramatic requires appreciating how different the Congo Basin is from the environments that most people imagine when they think of wilderness. The basin covers more than 1.5 million square miles across 6 Central African nations, a territory so vast that the entire Amazon rainforest could be contained within it with room to spare. Its rivers and tributaries form a network of extraordinary complexity, creating zones of permanent flooding and seasonal inundation that have produced swamp forest ecosystems existing in essentially their current form for millions of years. This temporal stability is perhaps the most important single fact about the Congo Basin from the perspective of understanding what it might contain. While ice ages reshaped the northern hemisphere and drought cycles restructured ecosystems across much of tropical Africa, the Congo Basin remained largely intact, functioning as a refuge where species that had disappeared from the rest of the world could persist in populations that never needed to adapt to the catastrophic changes that drove extinction elsewhere. The evolutionary history of giant snakes gives this environmental context its full significance. Approximately 60 million years ago, a snake called Titanoboa occupied the tropical swamp forests of what is now Colombia, reaching lengths of 40 to 50 feet and weights exceeding a ton, the largest snake that science has definitively confirmed in the fossil record. Titanoboa thrived in conditions of high temperature and abundant prey that allowed it to sustain the metabolic demands of a body that size, before losing its advantage when the climate cooled and the tropical forest contracted. But the principle it demonstrated, that snake body plans are not inherently limited to the dimensions that modern species have reached, has always been there in the fossil record for anyone willing to take it seriously. The Congo Basin represents almost exactly the conditions under which Titanoboa flourished: warm, stable temperatures, abundant waterways providing both habitat and prey, and a degree of geographic isolation and ecological stability that could sustain a lineage through intervening millions of years without the pressures that drove giant snakes to extinction elsewhere. The discovery that something Titanoboa-like has persisted in this environment is extraordinary, but it is not inexplicable. It is precisely what the ecological and evolutionary logic of the region suggested.